When last we looked at Aristotle, we saw that he presents the view of virtue in terms of hitting the mean. And the mean, of course, follows essentially the Goldilocks theory of ethics. The basic idea is that one avoids excess, too much, and deficiency, too little, by hitting the mean, the just right. And now we turn to looking at the remainder of Aristotle's virtue theory, beginning by looking at the doctrine of the mean applied to various particulars. Now Aristotle gives numerous examples of how his moral theory of virtue in the mean applies to specific cases. What I'll do is look at a few of these to sort of illustrate it, but not go through all of them in unnecessary detail. Now one good example of this is the case of fear and confidence. In this case, the mean is courage. Now a person who has excessive confidence, would be rash, and this would of course be a bad thing because they would tend to engage in behavior that could get themselves or others hurt or killed. And a person who has too much fear and too little confidence would be a coward, and that of course would be bad as well. So middle ground is being not foolhardy, not cowardly, but just right, brave enough for the situation. Now he also considers a variety of other particulars, such as money, ambition, anger, and even truth. In the case of money, one could basically spend too much, and be tasteless and vulgar, or a person could spend too little and be petty, kind of a Scrooge. And the idea is to hit it just right. Similarly with ambition, someone who has too much ambition can lead to troubles. Someone who has too little, also troubles. Interestingly, Aristotle also takes the truth to have a mean as well, because someone who is excessive he regards as boastful. Someone who is deficient is lacking as well, and someone who hits the mean is doing it just right. And of course anger provides a good example as well. Someone who is too angry obviously will get in considerable trouble. Someone who's not angry enough will get in less trouble, but of course will not respond appropriately to situations in which anger is justified. And the person who hits the mean gets it just right. They're appropriately angry, not too much, not too little. Now Aristotle, since his goal is to provide us with very practical goals and rules in order to be good, he presents a summing up of his view as well as 3 handy rules to help us reach the mean. Now, as I noted before, for Aristotle, moral virtue is a mean between 2 vices. One is excess, too much, and the other deficiency, a lack. And so the objective is to hit that middle point. And it's difficult to do this. And he draws an analogy to getting the exact center of a circle. Now, someone can kind of take a stab at it, but in order to get the exact center of the circle, one must know how to do the calculations, the measurements. In the case of virtue and vice, the same way. It's easy to be angry at someone, or to simply spend money. But to feel or act towards the right person, to the right extent, at the right time, for the right reason, in the right way, is not easy. And hence he considers the achievement of virtue to be laudable and fine. And again, to help us in this achievement of virtue, he provides 3 practical rules. The first rule is this: to keep away from the extreme which is more contrary to the mean. And he presents, advice from Calypso, the goddess of the sea, who says, "Far from the surf and surge, keep thou thy ship." And so his view is basically, sort of go with that analogy, if you consider, one's, extreme to be further out to sea, the other like being up on the rocks, obviously it's better to be a little bit too far out than too close to the rocks. Obviously it's ideal to be exactly where you should be, but an error of being too far away from the shore generally is less harmful than being right up on those rocks. To use an example, consider anger. In general, being too angry leads to more trouble than not being angry enough. True, a person who just doesn't anger, that can cause problems as well, but in general more trouble has been caused by excessive anger than too little anger. So the gist of the practical rule is realize which extreme, too much or too little, is more problematic, and keep away from that one. Because if you're going to be in error, it's better to be in error in the way that's going to cause the least amount of trouble. Now the second rule he presents is this, which is we must notice errors into which we are liable to fall and drag ourselves in the contrary direction. And as he notes, we all have different natural tendencies. A person, for example, may be more inclined to be cowardly than brave, or a person may be more prone to give into anger than to be insufficiently angry. And so what a person needs to do, at least according to Aristotle, is know themselves, to know which way they're likely to go. So someone who's prone to anger needs to pull themselves away from that anger. Someone who's prone to, say, being overly stingy needs to pull themselves away from that towards generosity. The third practical rule he gives is that we must be on guard, especially against pleasure and pleasant things, because we are not impartial judges of pleasure. And he presents another story about how the elders of Troy, when Helen was brought to their city, basically said to not keep her in the city. And of course they turned out to be right because Troy ended up being destroyed. A lot of people died. And so the idea that Aristotle presents is to be on guard against pleasure. Not reject pleasure and run away from it, but the idea is to be on guard against it because it can easily lead us into trouble. So those are his three practical rules. Keep away from the contrary extreme, know the likely areas one is to fall into, and be on guard against pleasure. Now by following these rules, he believes we have the best chance of hitting that mean. Now, this is a difficult thing, and he notes this. It's not easy to determine the right way to be angry, with whom, on what grounds, for how long, and to what extent. But as he notes, if someone can get it sort of in that general zone of the mean, then that is a fine thing. And so the idea is one who goes too far is to be censored, condemned for this, but a person who's able to keep it in the middle is worthy of praise. And so he considers this to be, again, a practical matter. And so the idea is to follow the mean, and the general rule is it's difficult to define things exactly, but the idea is through proper understanding, one will tend to hit that mean, which he considers to be the essence of his theory. And that brings us to the end of looking at Aristotle. We'll next take a look at some problems with virtue theory, and that will follow this particular bit.